John Cena thought he had seen it all: fame, battles, and challenges beyond imagination. But nothing could have prepared him for what he would face on this day. What started as a simple funeral visit turned into a shocking discovery that no one saw coming. How far would he go to uncover the truth? And who was trying to bury it forever? Watch until the end to find out. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments, what would you do in his place? John Cena had received many calls in his lifetime: business deals, movie roles, charity events, and old wrestling buddies catching up. But this call was different. It came late in the evening while he was resting after a long day of training. The voice on the other end was shaky, filled with anguish. "John, he's gone. Josh, my son, is gone." John sat up immediately, his heart pounding. The voice belonged to Michael Carter, his longtime friend from their early wrestling days. Michael had left the industry years ago to raise his family, and John had always respected him for it. "What happened?" John asked, his voice steady but concerned. "They said it was a heart attack," Michael replied, his voice cracking. "John, he was 19. 19! How does a healthy 19-year-old just die like that?" John frowned. He had met Josh a few times, a bright kid, full of energy and ambition. The last time he saw him, Josh had talked endlessly about his dream of becoming an engineer, about the internship he had just started at a major firm. The thought of him suddenly dropping dead from a heart attack didn't sit right. "Where are you now?" "I'm at home. The funeral is tomorrow, at Greenwood Cemetery, 10 in the morning." "I'll be there," John said without hesitation. "John, you don't have to—" "I'm coming," John interrupted. "You don't have to go through this alone." Michael broke down in sobs on the other end before finally whispering, "Thank you." John hung up and sat in silence for a moment. Something didn't feel right. He had been around enough tragedies to know when something didn't add up. The way Michael sounded, the way he questioned everything, it made John's gut tighten. He got up, grabbed a duffel bag, and packed for the trip. He didn't know what he would find when he got there, but one thing was certain: he wasn't just attending a funeral. He was searching for the truth. The next morning, John arrived in Chicago and made his way to Michael's house before the funeral. The air was thick with grief. Mourners were gathered in small clusters, whispering condolences. The house smelled of flowers and burning candles. Michael looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his suit slightly wrinkled as if he had slept in it. "John," he said, pulling him into a tight hug, "I can't believe you're here." "Of course I am," John said. "How are you holding up?" Michael exhaled heavily. "Not great. Everything's happening so fast. The funeral home, the arrangements. I can barely think." John nodded. "Did they do an autopsy?" Michael shook his head. "No. They said it wasn't necessary. The doctor signed off on the death certificate, natural causes. But John, it doesn't make sense." John narrowed his eyes. "Who was the doctor?" "A guy named Dr. Whitaker. Works at the same funeral home that handled everything. He's been overseeing the process from the start." Something about that didn't sit right with John. A doctor connected directly to the funeral home. No autopsy for a teenager who had no prior health issues. It was all too clean. Before John could press further, a woman approached. She was young, her face pale and eyes red from crying. "Mr. Cina?" she said hesitantly. John turned to her. "That's me. And you are?" "Natalia. I was Josh's girlfriend." John softened. I'm sorry for your loss." She nodded quickly, but there was something nervous about her demeanor. She looked around as if afraid someone was watching. "I need to tell you something," she whispered. Michael stepped closer. "Natalia, what is it?" She glanced around again before speaking in a hushed tone. "Last night, I was near the funeral home. I wanted to see him one last time, but they wouldn't let me in. I stayed outside for a while, and I swear, I heard something. I heard a noise coming from inside the casket." John's blood ran cold. "What kind of noise?" "A faint tapping, like someone trying to get out." Michael turned pale. "That's not possible." "I know what I heard," Natalia insisted. "I tried telling the funeral director, but he laughed it off, said it was just my imagination. But what if he isn't really—" Michael shook his head, covering his face with his hands. No, don't say that. Don't give me false hope." John wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but his gut told him something was wrong. "We need to open that casket," John said firmly. Michael looked at him, his expression torn between fear and desperation. "John, if we do this, if we're wrong, and if we're right," John cut in, "if Josh is alive in there, are you willing to take that chance?" Michael swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "No, we do it. We open it." John nodded. "Then we better move fast, because if someone is behind this, they're not going to let us do it easily." Michael's hands were shaking, but his voice was firm. "Let's go." John clenched his fists. This wasn't just a funeral anymore. This was a race against time. John and Michael arrived at Greenwood Cemetery just before 10 in the morning. The air was cold, the sky overcast as if nature itself was mourning. A large crowd had already gathered, dressed in black, their voices hushed with grief. The casket was placed near the burial site, ready to be lowered into the ground. A priest stood beside it, solemnly preparing for the service. John scanned the scene, his senses on high alert. The funeral director, a man in his 60s with slicked-back gray hair, stood to the side, speaking quietly to Dr. Whitaker, the doctor who had signed Josh's death certificate. Something about their conversation seemed tense. Dr. Whitaker's eyes darted nervously, his hands fidgeting. John filed that detail away. Michael was trembling. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know if I can do this," he murmured. John placed a firm hand on his friend's shoulder. "We have to." Michael gave a tight nod and took a deep breath. The priest stepped forward to begin the service. "We gather here today to mourn the loss of a young soul, Joshua Carter, taken from us too soon." As the priest spoke, John kept his gaze on the casket. Natalia stood nearby, her eyes darting between John and the funeral director. She was just as anxious as he was. John took a step closer to the casket. "We need to open it." The funeral director's head snapped toward him. "Excuse me?" John kept his tone firm but respectful. "Michael has a right to see his son one last time." The priest hesitated. The guests murmured among themselves. The funeral director's face darkened. "I'm afraid that's not possible," he said. "The body has already been prepared for burial." John didn't budge. "Then it shouldn't be a problem, should it?" Dr. Whitaker stepped forward, his voice sharp. "This is highly inappropriate." Michael found his voice. "That's my son in there. If I want to see him, I will." The funeral director looked visibly irritated. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, everything has been handled properly. There's no reason—" "There is," Natalia blurted out. The entire crowd turned toward her. She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "Last night, I heard something coming from the casket." The whispers in the crowd grew louder. The funeral director's expression tightened. "That's ridiculous." John took a step closer, his presence looming. "Then let us open it." The funeral director glanced at Dr. Whitaker, who swallowed hard. They were nervous. "I'm afraid I cannot allow that," the director said. John's patience snapped. "You cannot allow a father to see his son? Who are you to make that decision?" Security guards moved forward, but John didn't flinch. "We're opening it, now." Michael, his hands shaking, turned to the priest. "Please, I need to do this." The priest hesitated, then slowly nodded. As his father, he has that right. The funeral director's face turned red with frustration. He had lost control of the situation. Michael stepped toward the casket. The tension was unbearable. John reached out and slowly lifted the lid. The crowd gasped. Josh's body lay still, dressed in a black suit, but something was wrong. His chest rose and fell, faint but unmistakable. Michael stumbled back. "Oh my God!" Natalia covered her mouth with both hands. John leaned in. "Josh?" The young man's eyelids twitched, his fingers barely moved. Dr. Whitaker turned to run. John's instincts kicked in. He lunged forward, grabbing the doctor's arm and yanking him back. "Where do you think you're going?" The crowd erupted in chaos. People shouted. Some ran to call for an ambulance. Others just stared in horror. Michael dropped to his knees beside the casket, gripping his son's hand. "Josh, can you hear me?" Josh's lips parted, barely forming words. His voice was weak, strained. "Dad," Michael sobbed. "I'm here, son. I'm right here." John kept his grip on Dr. Whitaker. "Start talking, now." The doctor's face was pale. I can explain." John's grip tightened. "You better." Sirens wailed in the distance. Help was coming. But John knew this was far from over. John held Dr. Whitaker firmly by the arm as chaos unfolded around them. People gasped and murmured, some still too stunned to move after witnessing Josh breathe inside the casket. Michael was sobbing, gripping his son's hand, and Natalia looked frozen, staring at Josh as if she couldn't believe what was happening. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The funeral director took a step back, his face pale, sweat forming on his brow. He turned as if to slip away, but John caught his movement. "Nobody moves," John said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Not until we get some damn answers." Dr. Whitaker struggled in John's grip, his eyes darting between the approaching police and paramedics. "You don't understand," he stammered. This is a mistake." John pulled him in closer, his voice low but menacing. "A mistake? A kid was about to be buried alive. Tell me how the hell that's a mistake." The paramedics arrived, pushing through the stunned crowd. One of them immediately checked Josh's pulse, while another shined a light into his eyes. "He's barely responsive," one of them said, shaking his head. "We need to get him to the hospital. Now." Michael refused to let go of Josh's hand. "I'm coming with you." One of the paramedics nodded. "Let's move." As they wheeled Josh away, Michael hesitated, looking back at John. His eyes were desperate, pleading. John gave him a firm nod. "Go. I'll take care of this." Michael followed the paramedics, disappearing with them into the ambulance. The moment they were gone, John turned his full attention back to Dr. Whitaker and the funeral director. "Start talking," he demanded. The funeral director raised his hands in defense. I didn't know anything. I was just following standard procedure." John narrowed his eyes. "Standard procedure doesn't involve trying to rush a burial for a kid who's still breathing." Dr. Whitaker swallowed hard, his face glistening with sweat. "Listen, Before he could finish, he yanked his arm free from John's grip and made a break for it. John reacted instantly. He lunged forward, grabbing Whitaker by the back of his collar and yanking him down. The doctor hit the ground hard, gasping as John pressed his knee into his back. "Where do you think you're going?" John growled. The police arrived just as John was restraining him. 2 officers stepped forward, quickly moving to take over. One of the officers looked at John. "Mr. Cina?" John stood up, allowing the officers to pull Whitaker to his feet and slap handcuffs on him. This guy was about to bury a living kid. You might want to ask him why. The officer nodded, turning to Whitaker. "You're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." "No, wait," Whitaker gasped. I was forced to do it." John stepped closer. "By who?" Whitaker hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the funeral director. The man's face went white as a sheet. John turned toward him. "You want to tell us what's going on, or do you want to wait until he rats you out first?" The funeral director shook his head violently. "I had nothing to do with this. I was just following the paperwork. I didn't know he was alive." John scoffed. "Bull. You fought hard to keep that casket closed. Who are you protecting?" Before the funeral director could respond, Whitaker blurted out, "It was them, the company. They told me to sign the certificate, no questions asked." The officers exchanged glances. "What company?" Whitaker hesitated again, his lips pressed together as if weighing his options. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply. "Westwood Financial." John's jaw tightened. He recognized that name. It was a high-profile corporation with hands in everything: real estate, investments, and, apparently, the funeral business. "Why would a finance company want Josh dead?" John asked, his voice low and deadly. Whitaker licked his lips. He worked there, as an intern. He found something. I don't know what, but they told me to make sure he never woke up again. They paid me to sign the papers, to make it all look natural. I swear, I didn't know he was still alive." John clenched his fists. "So, you just sold out a kid's life for money?" Whitaker flinched but said nothing. The officer shoved him toward the squad car. "We'll take it from here. We're bringing him in for questioning." The funeral director lifted his hands. "I swear, I didn't—" "You're coming too." The officer cut him off, signaling for another cop to cuff him. John watched as they were led away, but his mind was already racing ahead. Westwood Financial. That name wasn't going to leave his head until he found out exactly what Josh had uncovered. He pulled out his phone and dialed Michael. The call connected almost instantly. "John? Josh is stable? They're running tests, but he's alive. That's all that matters." John exhaled, relieved. "Listen to me. This wasn't random. It wasn't a mistake. Whitaker just admitted he was paid off by Westwood Financial." Michael was silent for a long moment. "That's where Josh was interning. I know, and whatever he found, it almost got him killed." Michael's voice turned steely. "Then we find out what it was." John nodded. "Damn right we do." Hanging up, he looked toward the darkening sky. This wasn't just about saving Josh anymore. This was about justice. John arrived at the hospital within the hour. The waiting room was quiet, filled with the sterile scent of disinfectant and the muffled sounds of hospital staff moving through the hallways. Michael was sitting in a chair outside Josh's room, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharper now, filled with something more than grief. He looked up as John approached. "How is he?" John asked, his voice steady. Michael exhaled. Stable. They said he's weak, but he's recovering. Whatever they gave him, it kept him in some kind of coma. The doctors are running tests to make sure there's no permanent damage." John placed a reassuring hand on his friend's shoulder. "He's strong. He'll pull through." Michael nodded, but his face darkened. "What about Whitaker?" John sat down next to him. "He and the funeral director are in custody. Whitaker confessed that Westwood Financial paid him to falsify Josh's death. He doesn't know exactly what Josh found, but whatever it was, someone at that company wanted him gone." Michael clenched his jaw. "I knew something was off. Josh told me a few weeks ago that he was working on a big project, something related to company finances. He said he noticed irregularities in their reports." John narrowed his eyes. "Irregularities like what?" Michael shook his head. "I don't know. He never got the chance to tell me." John thought for a moment. "If Josh was working on something sensitive, there has to be a record of it. Emails, documents, something." Michael ran a hand over his face. "His laptop. It's at home." John stood immediately. "Let's go." They drove in tense silence. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. When they arrived at Michael's house, the air felt heavier. He unlocked the front door and led John inside. The house was quiet, the weight of the past few days pressing down on every surface. Michael moved straight to Josh's room and opened the door. It was neat, organized. Textbooks stacked on the desk, framed photos on the shelves. His laptop sat in the center of the desk, untouched since he had last used it. Michael powered it on. "I don't know his password." John stepped forward. "Try his birthday." Michael typed it in. Incorrect. He tried again with different variations. Nothing worked. John exhaled. He was a smart kid. He probably used something more complex. "Do you have access to his email? Maybe we can reset it." Michael pulled out his phone, searching through his contacts. "I don't, but Natalia might. She and Josh shared school projects. She might have used his laptop before." He called her. She picked up after 2 rings. "Michael?" "Natalia, we need Josh's laptop password. Do you know it?" She hesitated. I think so. He let me use his laptop once for a project. Try Future Engineer 2024. Capital F, capital E. Michael entered it. The screen unlocked. He and John exchanged a glance before clicking into Josh's files. Most of them were school-related, but then they found a folder titled Westwood Financial Confidential. John clicked on it. Inside were spreadsheets, reports, and email screenshots. They scanned through them quickly. Michael's face turned pale. "Oh my God," John frowned. "What?" Michael pointed at a section of an email. It was from a Westwood executive instructing an employee to divert millions of dollars into shell companies, fake businesses used to launder money. John's jaw tightened. They were committing fraud, large-scale money laundering. Michael scrolled further. Josh must have found out. That's why they went after him. John nodded. They thought silencing him would keep this buried. They didn't expect him to survive. Michael's phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Michael Carter?" Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" A deep, calm voice responded. "I believe you have something that belongs to us." John and Michael exchanged a look. "What are you talking about?" Michael asked. "The files, you know exactly what I mean. You have 2 choices. Hand them over quietly, or deal with the consequences." Michael's breath quickened. John reached out and put the call on the speaker. John spoke calmly but firmly. "And what happens if we don't?" A pause, then the voice responded. "People close to you start getting hurt. You don't want that, Mr. Carter." Michael's hands shook with rage. "You tried to kill my son. You think I'm just going to hand this over?" The voice remained eerily composed. "I think you'll make the smart choice. You have 24 hours. The call ended. John stood, his expression cold and determined. "We're not handing anything over." Michael nodded, gripping the laptop. "Then we take this to the police." John looked at him. "Not yet. If these people are powerful enough to order a cover-up, they might have people inside law enforcement. We need to be careful." Michael clenched his fists. "What do we do?" John's eyes darkened. "We go on the offensive. We expose them ourselves." Michael swallowed hard. "How?" John smirked. "We make it public. We take away their power before they even have a chance to use it." Michael nodded, his fear replaced by determination. "Let's do it." As they packed up the laptop, John glanced out the window. A black car was parked across the street. The engine was running. They were being watched. This fight was just beginning. John and Michael knew they had no time to waste. The call from the mysterious voice had confirmed their worst fear. Westwood Financial wasn't just some corrupt company skimming money. They were powerful, connected, and dangerous. They had nearly succeeded in burying Josh alive, and now they were watching, waiting for Michael to make the wrong move. But John had no intention of giving them that chance. The black car was still idling across the street. John peered through the blinds, his sharp eyes scanning for details. Tinted windows, no visible plates. This wasn't just a random vehicle. Someone was inside, observing them. Michael tightened his grip on the laptop. "What do we do?" John stepped away from the window, his voice low and firm. "We don't panic. That's what they want. We stick to the plan. Expose them before they can silence us." Michael exhaled shakily. "Josh almost died because of this. I won't let them get away with it." John nodded. "Then let's make sure we take them down right." They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. Taking the laptop to the police was too risky. If Westwood Financial had infiltrated law enforcement, the evidence could disappear the moment it entered the system. They had to go public, but they needed a way to do it safely. John grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He knew people: journalists, whistleblowers, cybersecurity experts. He needed someone who could not only verify the files but also spread them fast enough that Westwood wouldn't have time to suppress the information. He landed on a name: Daniel Brooks, an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corporate fraud. John had met him years ago when working on a charity case, and he knew Daniel had one thing Westwood Financial feared: an audience. John dialed. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Brooks?" "Daniel, it's John Cina." There was a pause. "John Cina? Didn't expect to hear from you. What's this about?" "I've got a story for you, one that's going to blow the roof off of Westwood Financial." Silence on the line, then, "I'm listening." John kept his voice steady. "We have hard evidence of large-scale fraud, millions being funneled through shell companies. But it's bigger than that. They tried to bury the only person who found out. Literally." Daniel cursed under his breath. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. And we don't have time. They know we have the files and they're watching us." Another pause, then Daniel spoke with certainty. "Send me everything. I'll verify it. If it checks out, I'll make sure the world knows." John looked at Michael. "You ready to send it?" Michael nodded and quickly transferred the files from Josh's laptop to a secure link Daniel provided. They watched as the progress bar filled. Within moments, it was done. It's sent, John confirmed. Daniel exhaled. Give me an hour. John hung up and turned back to the window. The black car hadn't moved. Michael swallowed. They're waiting for us to make a mistake. John's voice was cold and unwavering. Then let's make sure they regret waiting. The next hour was agonizing. They sat in silence, tension thick in the air. John checked the window every few minutes, his instincts sharp, his body ready to move at the first sign of danger. Then Michael's phone buzzed. It was Daniel. Michael put him on speaker. Talk to me. Daniel's voice was urgent. It's real. The documents, the transactions. I've got financial analysts confirming everything right now. Westwood Financial has been moving money through fake accounts for years. But this is enough to sink them. We're going live with it in 30 minutes. Michael let out a shaky breath. You think it'll be enough to stop them? Daniel's voice was firm. Once this hits the media, there's no stopping it. The SEC, the FBI, they'll have no choice but to investigate. But listen to me. If they know you sent this, they won't just sit back. Be ready for anything. John's grip tightened. We already are. The call ended. They had done it. They had put the truth in motion. But John knew it wasn't over yet. Outside, the black car suddenly pulled away from the curb. Michael tensed. What does that mean? John exhaled. It means they know. Within minutes, his phone buzzed again. A text. Unknown number. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. John stared at the screen. Then he smirked. No, you did. The storm was coming, and John was ready for it. John stood by the window, watching as the black car disappeared into the night. His phone was still in his hand, the ominous message glowing on the screen. He knew threats like this weren't empty. Westwood Financial had already tried to bury Josh alive. Now that their secret was out, they had nothing left to lose. Michael sat at the table, gripping his phone with white knuckles. Do you think Daniel's got enough traction? Will this actually take them down? John's voice was steady. The moment that story hits, there's no going back. We forced their hand. Now it's about making sure they don't try to silence us before the world catches up. The tension in the room was thick. The television was on, muted, waiting for Daniel's report to air. Michael glanced at the clock. 10 minutes. John's phone vibrated again. Another unknown number. He didn't answer. A text came through seconds later. You don't know who you're dealing with. Walk away while you still can. John exhaled through his nose. He had dealt with bullies before, in the ring and out of it. He wasn't intimidated, but this wasn't just about him. It was about Josh, about Michael, about the truth they had fought to expose. A noise outside made John's instincts flare. Footsteps. Heavy. Fast. Someone was coming up the walkway. He motioned for Michael to stay back as he moved toward the door. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He flung it open and grabbed the figure by the collar, yanking them inside before they had a chance to react. It was Natalia. Her eyes were wide with panic. John! Michael! We have a problem. Michael stepped forward. What is it? She was breathing hard, looking over her shoulder like she had been followed. I was at the hospital. 2 men in suits came in asking about Josh. They weren't doctors. They weren't family. They were looking for him. Michael's face paled. Oh my God. John's mind raced. Did they see him? No, Natalia said quickly. The nurses wouldn't let them in without ID, but they said they were with the company, that they needed to secure the situation. Michael ran a hand through his hair. They're going to try to finish what they started. John grabbed his keys. We're not letting that happen. Let's go." They didn't waste time. Within minutes, they were in Michael's car, speeding toward the hospital. The streets were quiet, but John's gut told him that wouldn't last. Westwood Financial wasn't just sending threats, they were making moves. They pulled into the parking lot, and John spotted 2 black SUVs near the emergency entrance. The men standing outside them were tall, dressed in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. John had seen enough enforcers in his life to know what they were. Michael clenched the steering wheel. "What do we do?" John's voice was firm. "We walk in like we belong there. Stay close." They entered the hospital, keeping their pace steady. John's eyes scanned the hallways, checking for any sign of Westwood's men. He spotted them near the nurses' station, questioning a staff member. Josh's room was just down the hall. "Go," John murmured to Michael and Natalia. "Get to him. I'll handle them." Michael hesitated, but John didn't give him a choice. He stepped forward, heading straight for the men in suits. They noticed him immediately. One of them squared his shoulders. "Can we help you?" John's expression didn't change. "Yeah, you can turn around, get in your car, and drive away before this gets ugly." The man smirked. "You have no idea who you're messing with." John cracked his knuckles. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing." The second man moved first, reaching inside his jacket. John didn't wait to find out what he was grabbing. He struck fast, his fist slamming into the man's ribs, sending him staggering back. The first man lunged, but John caught him by the wrist, twisting hard before driving a knee into his stomach. The fight was over before it started. Both men were on the ground, groaning in pain. John crouched beside them, his voice low. "Tell your bosses something for me. Josh Carter is off limits, and if you come near him again, I'll make sure you regret it." The first man coughed, glaring up at him. "You think this ends here?" John's smirk was cold. "No, I think this ends when the world sees exactly what kind of criminals you work for." The men didn't say anything else. They staggered to their feet and limped out the door. John turned and rushed toward Josh's room. Inside, Michael was at his son's side, gripping his hand tightly. Josh was awake now, his eyes heavy with exhaustion but alive. Natalia stood nearby, tears in her eyes. Michael looked up as John entered. "Is it over?" John exhaled. "Not yet, but it will be." The television in the corner of the room flickered. A breaking news alert flashed across the screen. Daniel Brooks appeared on the broadcast, his voice clear, confident. "Tonight, we bring you an exclusive report on one of the largest financial fraud scandals in recent history. Documents obtained by our sources reveal a shocking pattern of corruption, money laundering, and an attempted cover-up that nearly cost a young intern his life." Michael let out a shaky breath. They did it. The story's out. John watched the screen, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Westwood Financial was finished. There would be no coming back from this. Josh's voice was weak but firm. "Thank you." John met his gaze. "You did the hard part, kid. You survived." The weight of the past few days hung heavy in the air, but for the first time the fear was gone. Michael squeezed his son's hand. "We're going home?" John nodded. "Yeah, and if Westwood tries anything again, they'll regret it." As the news continued playing, the truth spread to the world. The fight was over. Justice had won, and John Cena had once again proven that sometimes the biggest fights weren't in the ring. They were in the real world. Justice prevailed, but the battle was far from easy. John Cena stood his ground, proving once again that the truth cannot be buried. But what if he hadn't acted in time? How many more secrets remain hidden in plain sight? What do you think about this incredible story? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next gripping story.